Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. Super pumped to bring you part one of the off-season's projection special podcast series with Ben Gretch. Ben, of course, has his Substack at bengretch.substack.com and does a podcast with Sean Siegel of RotoViz called Stealing Bananas. Make sure to check all that stuff out. Ben's also been doing a lot more YouTube streaming, looking at underdog drafts and whatnot this year via his Substack. So absolutely check that out. We've done this the past few seasons, Ben. It's always a hit with the listeners. So I'm super pumped to have you back and go through the projections once again this year.
I'm getting the DMs that are like, oh, man, I hope you guys are just a little bit behind this year because I'm really hoping that you're going to be doing this thing with Leone again. And I was like, man, we're recording this week. We're almost there. It's my favorite day of the year, Leone. It's not week one. It's the first day that we start this projections pod series.
And it is challenging timing wise now with, best ball being so popular. I mean, like you've got Best Ball Mania and like, I don't know, 25% full already. I made that number up, but it's a higher number than you'd expect. And you've got some tournaments, some like they're on like, multiple puppy iterations already. So we like to get it out, but we also want to have information that is as useful as possible. So we're going to try and finish these by the end of July so that you have them for August. I think we're going to be able to do that. We're starting recording this one on Wednesday, July 3rd. You might not get to it until the weekend, given the holiday and everything. But quick primer for anyone who hasn't listened to us before, but it's super valuable for us to compare projections because we do some things similarly, we do some things differently. The important thing we want to stress is like we're trying to look at the range of outcomes, even though this is based around like the mean projection, the average projection for each player. So you're going to hear me talk about the ceiling cases we have at ETR. There's going to be cases where Ben's like, yeah, I hate that I have, we'll start with Tampa Bay, where, I hate that I have Rashad White for 224 carries, but like, here's why I maybe, like him or don't like him as far as drafts go. So keep in mind that, the season only plays out one way, but there's a big range of outcomes. And we're going to try and highlight the spots where we're kind of like confident in the projection and highlight spots where we're not confident in the projection and spots where maybe it's not a confidence thing, but we say like, ooh, if this happens, this really exciting thing could stem from it, or this really bad thing could stem from it. So just like little like high level of kind of like how we're trying to approach that. We'll share the inputs from a team level and individual level that we're looking at. Anything else to add, Ben, before we dive into the Bucs and the NFC South?
I think you said it really well. I mean, it's kind of a moving target throughout the year. Key injuries can happen that can change all the assumptions, all of that. We're trying to tell you what assumptions we're making and why our results came out how we did, so you can disagree with the assumptions we made and come to different answers if you don't agree with us. And we are going to disagree, like you said. We don't think these are gospel by any means, but it's a lot of really good research to work through how the season could go. And then the one other note I was going to say that we always mention is I come in hot on all my projections, right? Like I come at it from more of like I don't assume a lot of injuries, and I come at it more from like a best case scenario, because that's what I get the most out of doing the projection is like I'm trying to see if things break right for this team and a reasonable, like we always say, like a 60th percentile outcome for my projections relative to yours, which are way more rigorous, and you're actually baking in the full range of outcomes. I'm just a little bit of an optimist with my projections, so they're going to be a little off the raw numbers at times, and usually when I'm coming in hot.
Yeah, and a couple notes on that. One, kudos to Ben, who's just doing all the work for his projections. I'm lucky to have a team at ETR where Jack Miller, Mark Dankenbring, they left me even some notes for this podcast ahead of time, and they're crushing the projections. So shout out to them. And about like the full range of outcomes, we're going to talk about our base projections here for both me and Ben. We do like ceiling assumptions in terms of like, this player's got a base target share of 16%. The receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns you hear on this podcast are based on that base target share, but we'll give like, hey, for our rankings though, we're factoring in that it could be 25%, where someone else with a base target share of 16%, the ceiling might still only be like 19%. There could be really big differences there. So we're doing the NFC South today. 4 new play callers, as Dank pointed out to me, as I was prepping for this pod, which is kind of crazy. New OCs, new play callers. We'll start with Tampa Bay. Obviously, Canales goes in division to Carolina to become their head coach. So they get a new OC. And But we right now are pretty similar on play calling. We've got them at about 62 to 62 and a half offensive plays per game. And we've got them for around a 60 to 61% pass rate. I've got slightly more pass attempts, but we're really splitting hairs. We both, come out with Baker Mayfield at just under 570 pass attempts.
Yeah, and so the baseline for plays per game usually just over 63. I think the last year we were using 63.3 as the prior year average. I think last year was 63.1. We got a little bit slower paced as a league last year, if I'm not mistaken. So we're projecting them within a play per game of average, but on the slightly slower side. And the pass rate, I think 60 to 61 is going to be pretty close to the average as well.
Yeah.
The concern for Tampa would just be that Canales was a big part of everything that worked, right? And that things might fall off efficiency-wise in those things. One little positive note is you mentioned the new play caller, Liam Cohen, comes from the Rams, where he was there when Baker came over there in season and got to work with him a little bit. And Baker had a decent little run there after leaving Carolina. Like, he went to Carolina in the offseason that year and was bad in Carolina, and then he ended up with the Rams the year that Matthew Stafford got hurt, and Baker played okay and leveraged that into the opportunity in Tampa, which he was pretty good last year. So, probably not a super fast paced or super efficient offense, but there's some reason for at least a little bit of optimism, I think.
Yeah. And Baker has been, one of the values that we're higher on than market at ETR, but a lot of times with these pocket passers, especially the ones that are going to be like back half of the draft, it's almost immaterial where you rank them. It is important where you see them as an offense in terms of considering your stacks early on, but I don't think there's too much to add on Baker. I think that running back position's really an interesting one. We had a ship chasing draft earlier where we took Rachaad White to Ben's dismay. And I was giggling a little bit when I see the projections. We're at 201 rush attempts for Rachaad White. Ben, the Rachaad White Bulls at 224 rush attempts. But again, as Ben noted off the top, he runs a little bit hotter, kind of like assuming health for these guys. And these are the base projections, which is like sometimes hard to spit out, where it's like the most likely case is Rachaad White is the RB1 for most of the season, leads the team in carries. That might not be the case that matters most for fantasy. So I'll throw it to you on Rachaad White to start, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great example of some of the things you were talking about early on about the ceiling case and all that stuff, where a lot of the base projections are not always going to be right at like the 50th percentile outcome or something. I would say for Rachaad White, who there's some real efficiency issues with. Sam Sherman, who works for you guys over at Established Run, does the waiver wire column, also does some stuff at ADP Chasing, shared a stat with me. I'm on the top 15 underdog running back ADPs, and their career rush yards over expected, I think from the NFL's next gen stats. 14 of the 15 are 60th percentile or higher in that. There are a couple that are lagging a little, Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon. 12 of them are 74th percentile or higher. So you're really talking about like the players that we rank in the top 15 in running back ADP tend to be guys that are really good in this stat. Rachaad White, I gotta pull up, is 19th percentile. So he's the 60th percentile or higher for everyone else. He's in the 19th percentile. He's really struggled as a running efficiency player. And when it comes to like what actually wins in fantasy relative to what projects well, we know that you need efficiency to have like the outlier league winning seasons. And so that's a concern for me on White in terms of actually taking him at his price, despite my projection looking solid for him. And then there's also the opportunity cost and the structural stuff with wide receivers in that range. I don't take a lot of White, but I do see where the workload could be solid and stable enough to justify it. He's especially been good in the pass game. I was talking about the run numbers.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic on White for a couple of reasons. One, the pass game that Ben mentions. We kind of like beg to get these guys that are really good in the pass game. And Rachaad White was not only heavily involved in the pass game, but he was quite efficient in that department. And it does make me question a little bit some of the running back efficiency metrics. Now everyone for Tampa Bay, they have not had good backs the last few years. So it's expected that they're all like not that good, but I do have a tough time when every single teammate is like egregiously bad in rush yards over expectation of like, how much of that is Rachaad White versus how much of that is the team. And I think it's probably a little bit of both. I do think it's kind of clear that we can say Rachaad White's not an explosive rusher of the football. We can quibble over like how good or bad he is, but he's not explosive. Whenever you're not explosive, you're at some degree of risk that a rookie like Bucky Irving comes in, is explosive, and takes over for you. But I do wonder if he's like more like an average rusher who is very good at receiving the football and has shown like a full workhorse potential. So I'm a little bit more in on White in these builds on Underdog, where if he slips to like the five, you get him at the 5-6 turn as like a hero RB build, you've already got a few wide receivers. So I'm not super into White, but I guess I'm just like, I don't dislike him or particularly like him. So, which is a little bit more bullish. I think Ben's more on a fade case at
and probably more of a best ball take for you, right? Than like a
yeah, I would say a little bit more of a best ball take. And we hit on this last year in this series, and it just continues to be so true that best ball versus redraft is just like a really divergent game. And sometimes it's hard for this podcast because I think initially we were thinking of this as more of like a redraft thing, but now best ball is so huge that it's kind of difficult. And there's going to be, especially when we talk about like some of these wide receivers, there's going to be guys that are like, oh, like I like this guy in the 15th round in best ball. And then for redraft, it's like, no, he's not even on my list. Like the
Right.
player pool in redraft is like a third of the size for me as it is best ball.
It really
best
is.
ball, I'd almost draft anyone given the right construction and the right price. Redraft, you're looking for league winners. If you don't think a guy's a league winner, the price doesn't matter a ton. It does a little bit, but not a ton. So that's a good call out that there's definitely a big discrepancy between redraft and best ball there. But let's talk about Bucky Irving. This one's interesting. You have him for 139 carries. We have him for 75 right now, splitting a bit more with Chase Edmonds. You have him as the clear RB2. I think we're going to shift this more to Bucky than we have it. Probably not to the extent you have it, but we're going to shift it after this podcast. This is the type of guy that I struggled this time of year drafting before we get the camp news and stuff, where it's like, again, the redraft comparison, like I love a guy like Bucky in redraft, even this time of year, where if he doesn't win the RB2 job, I drop him and pick someone else up, right?
For sure.
In best ball, if we're, sometimes assuming these rookies are going to come in, be the RB2 to start, and then if the RB1 gets hurt or they play well, they're going to surpass the RB1. They're awesome bets, but if they don't win that job, there's a little bit more downside to having that player on your roster as like the RB3 instead of the RB2. So how confident are you that Bucky's going to, come away with this RB2 job?
I agree with everything you just said. There's definitely downside risk here. I just did a little bit of an exposure look. You mentioned my YouTube channel earlier today on a stream. Bucky Irving's my highest drafted player in best ball. So on our very first team, this is the guy that I'm really all in on. How confident I am is very confident. I'll give you the kind of my quick explanation, but I just think largely it's that he's mispriced right now because he's going very late for what I think is some real upside. The first part of it, you just mentioned the other backups are kind of the same ones as last year, and they were really bad in all those efficiency metrics too. And so it's kind of like if they weren't able to get Rachaad White off the field at all, then they're certainly not going to, be too much competition for Irving if Irving's good at any kind of way. Irving was very productive in college. He didn't test particularly well, but after he didn't test particularly well, he was like the RB9 or RB10 in most people's pre-draft lists. He did last to the 4th round, but all running backs go a little later these days. The Bucs took him as the RB6. They took him over some other running backs that were arguably better prospects or ranked higher when you consider the athleticism stuff. So once you get that buy-in from the Bucs, I'm less concerned about the lack of athleticism testing. They think he's the back that he was production-wise at Oregon. There's some concern about his pass blocking, and that's why I actually have a bigger gap between the usage between White and Irving on the receiving side, because White is very good in the receiving stuff. We talked about that. But Bucky did have solid reception numbers at Oregon as well. I think he had over 50 catches last season in his final season, something like 95 over his career. I do think that Irving, as a rusher, very efficient in college, even though he doesn't test super explosive for a smaller back, is somebody who's probably like a decisive runner, some of those things that are harder to quantify. And I think he's probably the pretty clear number 2 And there's just not a lot of clear number twos that have like contingent value. And I would argue some potential for standalone value with a kind of fragile starter because of the skill-based stuff that we talked about that go as cheap as he does. That's the biggest reason I'm all in on him now is I do think his price is going to rise.
You are very confident Bucky's going to win the RB2 job. He's very mispriced. So I'm with you there. I'm going to try and get more of him. I think that's one where I might have been more blanket. Like I've been burned by like assuming these rookies are the RB2 in the past. And maybe in this scenario can afford to be more aggressive in that assumption.
That's my mindset
with Bucky. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm willing to make that bet here. When he gets a lot more pricey, I won't necessarily be taking him over the rookies going significantly higher than him, like a Marshawn Lloyd or something. If he got up to Marshawn Lloyd's price, I would prefer Lloyd. I'm not that excited about Irving's specifics. It's his cost, really. But I do think there are paths to White just being displaced. The fact that the starter isn't in a really entrenched elite starter. He's entrenched from workload perspective, but it's very reminiscent to me, not entirely, because we knew Jalen Warren was very good, but last year everyone was saying Najee Harris is definitely the workhorse for Mike Tomlin. He's always had workhorses, and Najee's been the workhorse, and he's going to be the workhorse. And then a lot of us were like, Jalen Warren is actually pretty efficient and is a threat. They were like 50-50 for a lot of the season last year. You're the workhorse until you're not. And when you're inefficient for multiple seasons, if Rachaad White's inefficient as a rusher again for year 3 this year, the door will be cracked open if Bucky Irving's good.
Yeah. The only like somewhat pro Rachaad White note that I just want to get in there before we move on. At the end of the day, all they did was bring in a late 4th round pick at running back to compete with him, which is not so bad. I do have concerns for sure, but the offseason could have broken a lot worse. And then we mentioned the backs, Sean Tucker, Chase Edmonds, who were just terrible. And he was able to keep those guys completely off the field. Let's look at wide receiver, a player that we're a little high on that I'm not super comfortable with right now is Mike Evans. We've got him for 120 targets, 70 catches, breaking 1,000 yards yet again. You've got him at 134 targets, 78 catches, 1146. We both have him for 8.5 touchdowns. So pretty similar projections, especially given some of the bias where Gretch is going to run a little bit hotter. I thought at the beginning of the offseason, Evans and Godwin were both tremendous values. Now I think Evans is probably appropriately priced. I know our ranking on him's a little high in the half PPR, given the way he scores points, but I've docked his upside case a little bit. Just some concerns on age. And, I think he was in the contract year last year. And historically, Godwin versus Evans have been like much closer. So Godwin is someone I'm taking a lot of that I feel pretty good about, where he's a couple years younger. I still think, him moving back into the slot should probably be a pretty good thing for him. You've got him at 122 targets. I've got him at 115. Wouldn't be totally shocked, though, if Godwin was able to match or even and beat out Evans in targets, just given some of the historical target per route run stuff. It's just how much do we weigh that versus the sample we have with Baker specifically?
Well, and I mean, last year, 136 targets and 130 for Godwin. Godwin actually had more catches. Now, the air yard stuff matters. You layer in any depth of target stuff, and Evans' workload looks a lot stronger. But their production was a lot closer in terms of targets and receptions than I think perception would have, than I even think I thought. And I'm very in the weeds throughout the season. But for the average listener, the major difference was Mike Evans had 13 touchdowns and Chris Godwin had 2. And I mean, how much do you want to put weight on the touchdowns? Obviously, Evans has been excellent at that throughout his career, so you can put weight on it. I'm not saying you can't, but it is important to recognize, and it gets to your point about Godwin could lead the team in targets. I mean, he was 6 targets away from doing it. They both played 17 games. The team only threw 28 touchdowns, so Evans 13 TDs last year, a little bit different than when he was doing it with Brady, where he caught almost half of their overall touchdowns. Like when Brady was throwing 45, it was a little different. That's where, if Evans fails to hit his number, that's where I think it comes, is he actually does have a little bit of a disappointing TD year because they don't throw 40-plus touchdowns. Having said that, my projection for Evans came out better than I thought it would. I'm also uncomfortable with where he comes out in a projection, but I do think it's probably closer to a ceiling case. I'm pretty aggressive on his TD rate because he's earned that, but we know that the age curve can often be an age cliff. Like some of this stuff could fall off fairly quickly. Don't have a ton to add on those guys. What I will say is I think both of them are in a good spot. because behind them, there's not really any target earners on this team. Like Cade Otton has run over 1,000 routes in his first 2 years. He has a sub 1.0 yards per route run, which is really, really bad. He's very low at targets per route run. He's totally a routes play at tight end. He's got some viability really late because he could run a ton of routes, but he could also lose those routes. He did have a couple good playoff games, so that's something worth noting. I'm not saying be completely out on him, but we probably have enough sample there that he's not a huge target earner. Trey Palmer looked decent, but wasn't a big target earner either. I think it's actually a nice path for Jalen McMillan, the third-round rookie, if he comes in and is good, that he could earn number 3 volume. But the other way of saying this is that a lot of the volume here could just go to the top 2 receivers.
Yeah. And with the Evans take, I'd say it's more if we're like a spot or 2 ahead of him at ADP where he goes. Like, I want to be even with the field with all those wide receivers where they're going. Like, I don't want to be over on Evans because we have him slightly ahead of, some of these other guys like Malik Neighbors, Nico Collins, like in that mix. Like, I don't want to be not taking those guys because of Evans. It's not that I'm avoiding him, but maybe not drafting him quite as aggressively as our rank. Am drafting Godwin pretty aggressively. Also drafting, you mentioned rookie Jalen McMillan. Shout out to your Huskies. Yeah, definitely curious on your thoughts on McMillan versus Trey Palmer for this wide receiver 3 spot. Right now, Trey McMillan is Trey McMillan. I'm combining names. Jalen McMillan is one of my highest exposure wide receivers early on. Part of that is I prefer drafting a lot of the rookie wide receivers late this early in the offseason compared to some of the running backs who might not even have the role that we're hoping. Whereas the receiver, if they're good, they're going to work their way up regardless of like what the role is. So yeah, I'm pretty hot on McMillan. So thoughts on McMillan versus Palmer?
In college, you mentioned I'm a Husky fan, and I watch these guys a lot. And in college, I was higher on. I'm pulling up some numbers. I apologize. I was higher on Jalen Polk than McMillan for the secondary receivers as a player. He's a bigger, more physical, more higher ADOT, breaks tackles after the catch, fun guy to watch. I typically like these more physical receivers. He makes contested catches. He does a lot of awesome stuff. But he also would disappear at times and have some lapses. And when I dug into the numbers, my take this offseason has been that Jalen McMillan's the one that has a much better chance to hit in a big way, hit a ceiling at the NFL level. Mostly because it took Polk until his 4th season to really earn volume in a decent way. And even then, his targets per out run this past year were just fine. McMillan was banged up most of the year and played just parts of games when he started to come back. He did end up with a 240 route sample. His targets per route run on that sample were very high, actually. Some of that's because he's a lower ADOT player. I just talked about that. You have to control for ADOT and those types of things. But that also follows what happened in 2022 when McMillan was healthy. That's the big thing people will talk about with McMillan's profile, as him and Roma Dunze were sort of the co-number ones in 2022, and Polk was the distant number 3. And then in 2023, when the Huskies had their really good season, McMillan was banged up and Polk really broke out. Again, my bias as a fan was toward Polk. My bias as an analyst would be towards McMillan, who went later in the draft. But I do think he's a guy who gets open better. He had 2 strong targets per out run seasons, a really strong 2022 at a younger age. We like to see the younger production from the collegiate profiles. I just think he's probably the kind of guy, like, even though, like, one of the frustrations for me as a fan was like he never really broke tackles after the catch. He had some drops issues. Like, he wasn't very reliable for me as a fan. But that type of player, if they can consistently get open, can still put up numbers. It's like a Will Fuller profile a little bit is the way that I've been thinking about it. I think that's sort of like his real ceiling. Fuller was a better prospect than him. But if he can consistently get to open spaces on the field and that translate that targets per route run stuff, he's not just an underneath slot guy. He did a lot in the slot, but he made plays down the field for the Huskies as well. He's a good player.
Yeah, and some of the offseason kind of coach speak has been that they think he can play outside, which will be important if Godwin's moving into the slot. We think, Tampa Bay is going to run a lot of 11 personnel. So there's going to be a third wide receiver on the field for the majority of their snaps. So if McMillan can win the job, like you said, translate some of that target per out run stuff and win those outside wide receiver routes, that's going to be pretty huge. You hit on Cade Otton being a routes guy, just to let people know how extreme it is. Otton led the NFL in snap share at 96.5% last year. George Kittle was 90%. and he was the only other tight end above 85%. So quite literally the ceiling for tight end snap share. Now, I take him late in drafts. I think, again, another guy in best ball where it's kind of like I can get a tight end who projects to play like all the snaps, like as in the 16th round, I can backdoor some Baker stacks. Like that's fine, but not super excited. The only like slight excitement I have on and Ben is sometimes we see tight ends break out, take longer to break out. And it is a guy that he's still young. This is his third year in the NFL, and he's been able to earn a pretty big role through the first 2 years. Is there any like slight optimism, even though the yards per out run stinks?
I think it's the 2 playoff games. And I know that's like, it's a really small sample, but I've been with how much he runs routes. There's not enough tight ends that run this many routes. To your point, like, can you give us anything? And so you're looking at his profile and you're like, can he earn volume? Can he do anything? He didn't do a lot his rookie year, didn't do a lot in the regular season last year, but they played 2 playoff games. The win against Philadelphia, you got 11 targets, caught 8 balls for 89 yards. And then the loss against Detroit, 8 targets, 5 for 65 and a touchdown, 19 targets in those 2 games when the team needed to win, when they were, obviously, pushing. Those, I think, were 2 of his 3 games all season where he had more than 6 targets. He had 1 other regular season game at 9. But yeah, I mean, 11 and 8 in those 2 playoff games those are the last 2 times we saw him. Maybe to your point, if there's a little bit of a late breakout, he doesn't need to be an elite target earner with this type of route volume. He just needs to be okay at it. He's been really poor the first 2 regular seasons of his career. I would point to, we got 2 little spike games in the playoffs. That would be the one reason.
And the spike games, that brings me one last point I'll make on Tampa Bay before we move on, but they were very positive PROE in the 2 playoff games. And I wonder if there's some upside here where this team, we've talked about how they've been horrible in rush yards over expectation, whether you blame the backs or not, that they just wind up in a spot where this pretty condensed snap share for these pass catchers, condensed target tree for these pass catchers, if they throw the ball 63% of the time, 64% of the time, things could start to look, pretty good here. That's one thing that's been a little bit on my mind when thinking through Tampa Bay, because as you said, like, we're at league average. We're not expecting like a positive PROE, but they might just have to if they can't run the ball.
Yeah, it's a good point. The Vegas win total being bet to the under, I think at 8.5. They won 9 games last year. They could just be a little worse. They could win 7 games and be in more pass situations as well.
Let's go to Atlanta next, because I got some hot Atlanta takes. So we'll go there.
Ooh, I hope they're the same as mine, because I'm excited.
This is, a really big sea change in terms of the offensive play calling here. I think we might be a little hot. We're at 64.5 plays per game, so a little bit above average. You're more right at league average at 63.5. And we're at 60.7% called pass rate. You're at 59.5%. So you're slightly below league average. We're slightly above league average. We might come down closer to league average in those categories.
I might go up.
A huge change right there.
I might go up. I like what you guys are doing here. Yeah, it's a huge change. Arthur Smith offenses, they were dead last in pass rate over expected last year. They were even lower to the negative the year prior, but they were second to last because the Bears were so extremely negative in 2022. But yeah, I mean, bottom 2 pass rate over expected each of the last 2 seasons. So just getting it back to league average would be a massive, massive gain, right?
Huge. And another funnel down effect is the quarterbacks here. And this is something we've talked about on past versions of this podcast. Like when they had Mariota, Ritter, Heineke at times, these are guys that will throw the ball away, will take sacks, will scramble. Now you've got a quarterback in Kirk Cousins who really doesn't do any of those things. So that's a really big change in terms of not only more called pass plays, but converting those pass plays into pass attempts. You and I both have Kirk Cousins around 600 pass attempts. This is a very big change from what we've seen for Atlanta. Market's obviously taking that into account to an extent, but there's going to be some stuff we talk about where I still think maybe they've not shifted full enough. You've got Kirk at 4,500 yards. We've got him at 4,400. We both have him in the high 20s in pass touchdowns. I have him as very undervalued. Again, if you don't have an Atlanta pass catcher, you're still probably not drafting Kirk, even if you think he's undervalued. But if you do get Pitts or London early, I think he's a really strong target in these best ball formats. Even I think in redraft, there's some appealing on teams where you might be more prone to draft the second quarterback. I suppose the big question is, are we dismissing too much in these projections the Achilles risk for Kirk Cousins?
I think it's a very fair question. I don't know how really to account for it, especially because he's not a quarterback that relies on athleticism to a huge degree. And we also have been hearing so much stuff about the Achilles rehab timeline being a little bit narrower than it was in the past. Aaron Rodgers was famously talking all last season that he was going to be back by the end of the season. So Cousins gets injured mid-season last year, is going to have, I think, plenty of time. He's already throwing. My expectation is that, like, for a pocket passer who, like you said, doesn't even throw the ball away a lot, just gets the ball out to his underneath guys, that he can get out there and play that way. It's more for me, I guess, a re-injury risk or like a compensatory injury or something like, or maybe he's just not all the way built back up. Like his muscles aren't, as strong and things because of an offseason rehabbing. But I gotta feel like he's going to be out there week one, especially after they draft Michael Penix as well. Like that's going to be a pushing thing to get Cousins out there and be like, look, I'm the starter. It's this could be a really like I have a couple notes here on the volume stuff as well. I wrote in terms of what's possible because this coaching staff comes over from the Rams. We get the defensive head coach, which is one note. It could be a little more run heavy as a result. First time offensive coordinator. He was the passing game coordinator for the Rams last year, Zach Robinson. I wrote that I'm projecting gains, but leaving some meat on the bone. I like that you guys you're projecting some of that meat right in there. The Rams have run a little bit above average in play volume. Cousins offenses have run a little bit above average. The win total is good. You'd think that they'd be a little bit above average. In 2023, in terms of what's possible, the Rams threw 53 more passes in Atlanta. Minnesota threw 101 more. Obviously, Cousins was in Minnesota. In 2022, the Rams threw 116 more. Minnesota threw 257 more. So in terms of this idea of like how much pass volume are they going to gain, one of the things I've seen about London's price is people say he hasn't even had a 120 target season. How are we projecting him at the 1-2 turn with 2 seasons of 110 to 120 targets? Well, our base projection, both of us, we're projecting 20 targets above his previous career high. And I think that's right. It's important to emphasize that. That's why we look at things like target share. That's why we look at things like targets per route run. That's the stuff that matters in terms of target earning. And London has shown well in those things. It's more difficult to consolidate volume in a higher volume pass offense. And some of those things need to be adjusted for and tweaked. But he's pretty clearly a good number one that's going to earn volume. And this team could add 100, maybe 200 pass attempts if you want to get aggressive. I mean, it could be so much more pass volume.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say right now, my highest exposure wide receiver on Underdog right now, Drake London. My highest exposure tight end is Kyle Pitts. So I'm in. The Kirk Cousins bench risk is something I've seen floated to with the Penix drafting. I think it's pretty small given the contract and also given their playoff odds. Like the odds that they're in contention in weeks 15 to 17 are really, really high. If you just back out the math from their odds to win the division, odds to make the playoffs, it's, he would have to play really bad for the team to not be in contention and for him to get benched, I think. And, obviously those aren't good scenarios, but those might be scenarios where your Kirk Cousins shares are kind of dust anyways.
Yeah. And his contract, a lot of us were digging into it. Like what the heck? They just drafted a top 10 quarterback. When is he going to play? This contract basically guarantees him 2 years. So the way I looked at it after they drafted the top 10 quarterback was, well, they're kind of thinking they're going to redshirt Penix for year one. It kind of gives Cousins a year and a half. The second year is where he could get benched because they have an out. But I think he's probably still the starter going into 2025, just based on the fact that they gave him so much guaranteed and he has so much guaranteed into next offseason, dead money and all that. They could potentially trade him and get somebody else to take on some of that. But they already paid the signing bonus, so there is a lot of dead money associated with that. I don't think a signing bonus was massive as far as contracts go. But regardless, I'm with you. I think it's very likely that Cousins is a starter for almost this whole season. They gave him enough money into next year that it would make it really tough for them to bench him for really any reason. And I mean, they have the easiest schedule in the NFL. They project for wins, like you were saying. I mean, this is a situation where we'd actually expect them to be good. I think they're going to win the division. I mean, like, this is not a particularly great division. They are the odds-on favorite to win the division in the market. And yeah, I mean, like, another note I have here for the Cousins impact on the pass attempts is what I'm projecting. It would be Cousins' lowest total in 4 years. I mean, it's like, it's just crazy, like how much volume could be added to this team.
And, you know, the sea change continues at running back, where it's not just play volume, pass rush stuff, but in terms of how they allocate the running back workload. Obviously, frustration with Arthur Smith last year, splitting Bijan with Tyler Algier. I don't think we're going to see any of that this year. We've got Bijan at 243 rush attempts, 79 targets. We think we're a little bit conservative. So I love to see your projection, which is 278 rush attempts, 90 targets, 335 full PPR points. We're at 281. I think we're probably going to start slanting a little closer your way. Honestly, like, an underdog, I have a tough time taking Bijan ahead of ADP for structural reasons. So his ADP is 7. I kind of take him 7. You know, I'll take him Puka right around there. If I'm in a redraft league or I'm playing on an FFPC where I know the running backs go early, and I can get my wide receivers, I can stockpile them, like the values, like I can get, you know, Rome Odunze in round 9 somewhere. Like I will take my Bijan ahead of some of these wide receivers. I'd say as high as where Chase goes in some of these. I really think like it's not crazy to think that Bijan's the 101 next year.
He arguably should be the RB1. I mean, I think I can make that case. When you think about the Rams coming over, there's just a lot of uncertainty with it. But with his profile coming out of college, a lot of people I think are hung up on year one and what he didn't do. I blame a lot of that on Arthur Smith personally. So it depends on, you know, what you think about what happened in 2023. But Kyren Williams last year had a running back touch share north of 90% in 6 of 10 games last year. Got every running back rush attempt in 3 of those games. That people in the fans community really like Tyler Algier. He had an awesome rookie season 2 years ago, but he's a day 3 back who was less efficient last year and isn't tied to the current regime, who's coming in and trying to establish, among other things, the mandate really is get the young high draft capital players the ball. I mean, Kyle Pitts famously, when Kirk Cousins came in to potentially get the number 8 from him, said, I will give you the number 8 if I just get targets for it, right? Like, these guys didn't enjoy playing in the Arthur Smith offense, or at least that's my perception of it. They haven't publicly said that. I'm not going to put those words in their mouth. I think the new coaching staff is very much going to try to get these guys the ball. And to your point about both London and Pitts as well, the Rams offense it's not just Kyren as a running back, but that is a really high touch share for backs. He had the second highest average snap share for running backs behind only Christian McCaffrey in the Rams offense. Assuming Zach Robinson does anything similar to that, which he probably will, there's a structural reason for that. They don't like to let the defense substitute within snaps. So they like to keep one running back on the field for the whole drive and also not substitute out of their 11 personnel heavy formations in the Rams. If Zach Robinson brings that over, which I think we kind of have to assume, you also get Drake London staying on the field every snap. You also get Kyle Pitts staying on the field every snap in a way that maybe he wasn't always in past seasons, and he's been banged up as well. This is a situation where you get the potential for concentration of targets to be very, very high, for concentration of running back workload to be very, very high. But as far as the Bijan part of it, for me, it's like, this is the Bijan season. This is what it sets up for when you do a projection, when you think through it, when you look at the new regime coming in, you look at the profile. If this guy's a star, usually we see a lot of the breakouts we see are year 2, right? I mean, this would be the year where year 2, they just say, we're going to ride this guy. We took him in the top 10 a year ago. Let him go have his 2,000-yard season. This would be that year. It sets up that way for me. I agree with you. I think he can go as high as ahead of McCaffrey if you're as bullish as I'm getting to. But obviously McCaffrey projects very well too. That would be more of an age point on McCaffrey. But this does feel like the Bijan season.
It's probably closer than the market has it.
Right.
I'm still going CMC. I'm a coward. With I just reaching at, you know, him being the 101 the last 4 seasons, but I definitely I see what you're saying for sure, and I'm like I'm following you. And not only Zach Robinson's impact, but if you look at Kirk Cousins' impact, I remember last year, like Alexander Madison, when Kirk Cousins was playing, was one of the leaders in like expected fantasy points per game. Like he was getting the opportunities. And then you funnel that down into the receivers we're going to take, like really concentrated route shares for his receivers. How much of that's, him versus the OC, but like KJ Osborne was like somewhat viable at times. And like that's somewhat important here when we're talking about like a pretty thin wide receiver room with two potential studs at the top of it, excluding Bijan for the pass catcher conversation. So you've got London at 147 targets, we're 138. Again, for us, that means like very comparable projections, around 260 full PPR fantasy points. I'm pretty comfortable taking him at the 1-2 turn. I had a hot take that I'd take him ahead of Garrett Wilson. I've backed off that a little bit, like factoring in some of the open score stuff and just that, Garrett Wilson's probably just amazing. But the open score stuff I wanted to talk about a little bit because Drake London's a guy that'll stick out there that looks bad in ESPN's open score. For anyone not familiar, it's a metric they've put together, kind of just like how good are you at getting open based on the player tracking data and whatnot. We dinged him a little bit. We're like, okay, maybe we shouldn't assume like this high of a target share plus this many increase in team pass attempts, but we're still like, even with that, in a half PPR setting, spitting out London as the correct pick at the 1-2 turn.
I mean, that's a great note. I haven't weighed the open score stuff, but even though you said even though you're considering that, and it still spits him out that way, and I think that's a strong and fair consideration. I think
he's like a 30% target share guy though. Like, I mean, it's like he could be.
Right. I mean, both Pitts and London's targets per out run stuff is solid over a multi-year sample. I mean, it wasn't as great for Pitts last year, but I look over the 3 years because he was banged up last year. He was really good coming out as a young rookie. I think it's also just kind of tough to look at some of the individual stuff given how weird the pass offenses were. I think some of that stuff you're seeing in open score could be in relation to the structure of the passing game. Like, I mean, I don't think that's a ridiculous take. I think the counter to that would be that you're just pointing the finger at Arthur Smith for everything. And that's maybe fair as a counter, but I'm comfortable pointing the finger at Arthur Smith for a lot.
Yeah. Also, I was talking to Dwayne McFarland of Fantasy Life, who was looking at some of this stuff, and he's kind of like, his take he relayed to me was sort of like, at the end of the day, he thinks who the quarterback chooses the targets, whether it's a good quarterback or not, is probably the best representation we have over any of these other metrics. And obviously that's where the targets per out run stuff that you evaluate comes into play, where at the end of the day, that's probably the most important thing. Who is the quarterback choosing to target? And it's been, Drake London and Kyle Pitts. The secondary wide receivers, Darnell Mooney, Rondale Moore, we've got pretty similar projections on these guys. We both have Darnell Mooney as the wide receiver 2, Rondale as the wide receiver 3. You're a little bit more bullish, and I did want to talk about that when I was talking with Jack and Mark before this podcast. We still have like almost 10% of the target share to like the fake unlisted wide receiver because we don't know who to give it to. So there's like even more room for like all these guys to come up. Obviously that assumes health for them, but did want to point that out that like in our projections, which is 50 targets, Rondale Moore, 68 Mooney, you've got 57 Rondale, 81 Mooney. There's room to come up. So another reason I really like this Atlanta stack in best ball, we think Kirk Cousins is undervalued. You can add stack partners pretty late if you take these guys around their ADP, and I think they're totally fine around their ADP. Any thoughts on the wide receivers behind London?
The thing I'll say about Mooney, he had 11.8% targets per out run last year. That was the clear outlier compared to his first 3 years, 17.9%, 21.9%, 18.6%. That 18 to 22% range for a high ADOT guy is really solid. Even if he's down at the 18% or 17 or 16%, 11.8% last year is very, very poor. But you have Justin Fields, who had sack issues, had trouble, getting the ball out you were talking about how this offense is going to change to where a lot of the dropbacks become pass attempts. That was a team where a lot of dropbacks did not become pass attempts, especially probably for the longest running routes down the field where he's either taking off and scrambling or getting sacked. And so I'm willing to say that, look, Darnell Mooney showed us some other stuff. He actually had a pretty solid targets per out run profile out of college as well. And so I actually think he was a pretty underrated player coming out and was doing it for the first couple of years. I don't think he's great or anything, but in addition to that take that this team tends to go a lot of 11 personnel, keep these guys on the field, I think there's a possibility that Mooney's, route shares are really high as well at times. It'll be interesting to see what it means for Rondale Moore, because I think some drives they'll play Pitts as the third receiver, like de facto third receiver in 11 personnel, and have a second tight end out there as like more of a blocker. And then other times they'll maybe have Rondale Moore out there and keep him out for the whole drive. I think where he's interesting, and you think about the Rams analogy again, is the Tutu Atwell stuff last year, where they started to use that exit motion to get Atwell free releases because he's a little smaller, get him on the run, curving up the field like the Dolphins were initially doing. And obviously Tutu, it didn't completely work out for him. He ended up getting benched a little later in the year because of size constraints, not the ability to not stay on the field and run block. And that could be a problem for Rondale Moore too. But I do think it's at least worth noting that Rondale Moore is a very explosive player. Size is the concern, but he's coming to a team now that has used a type of motion that gets undersized but explosive players off the line without having to, get jammed and stuff. You could see that work for him. And he was, a guy that we like coming out of college in terms of his age-adjusted prospect profile. I like taking him late too. I love the point you made about Cousins. I like backstacking with these guys because I think the routes will be concentrated. You noted that segment of the targets that you have for an unlisted Atlanta receiver. I feel comfortable that this is going to be a little more concentrated than most offenses. So my thought on that would be that probably push that towards some of the players. That would be, my kind of take on it. So I agree with everything you said. This is a fun team to stack, man. When I finished my projection, another note I have, I wasn't close to the market expectation on touchdowns. And so then I had to go back and juice some stuff because this team is expected to be better. And then you're like, okay, well, you're projecting X amount of touchdowns for Drake London and Kyle Pitts and Bijan, and they didn't do any of that last year. It's like, well, that's what the market's telling us. They're telling us this team's going to score points this year.
And Rondale, it's not like I'm hammering him, but if you have those correlations built in, it's a round 17, round 18 pick. It's very easy to tack on. There's not much opportunity cost. For Kyle Pitts, you have him at 220 PPR points. I have 188. You're at 121 targets. We're at 106. You're a little bit higher yards per catch, it looks like. But yeah, I think you can throw out some of the past touchdown stuff for Pitts. I'm expecting that to be much better for him. Just more intelligent usage. The overall, it all funnels back to him. The hardest part with Pitts is, in these drafts, there's obviously a lot of really good tight ends this year. And if you've already taken one before you can take Pitts, it's hard to take Pitts as a second one. That's probably the only thing that's even keeping my exposure remotely in check, but I'm at about
but you're hammering him.
I love Pitts. I have 21% Pitts right now, but I think once some of my active drafts clear, it'll probably be about 25% Pitts. So I'm about triple the field.
You're the Pitts bull this year. I've tried to talk to people into Pitts in past seasons. I have the issue that you just said where I'm really into Trey McBride, and I wind up taking a tight end often prior to Pitts if it's McBride or someone else. And then I'm above market on Pitts comfortably, but I don't think I'm in the 20s like you. So you get to be the Pitts bull this year.
I'm more even with all the other guys and then smashing Pitts, sort of.
Yeah.
Roughly is where I'm at right now.
One other note I wanted to mention on this offense real quick before we move on, because we are in full agreement that Kyle Pitts, for all those reasons we said, he's way more affordable than Drake London too, but could just have the really strong routes concentration. And the production could be massive. We don't even know that he's worse than Drake London. He was banged up last year. What if he's the better player? He's looked that way at times. Anyway, the other note I wanted to say is wide receiver rushing is a key in this Rams offense. They've always had a lot of running carries. So I gave Rondale Moore 11 carries. I think that might go to him a little bit. And so that's something else about his profile, how he could be maybe a little bit viable. He could get some rushing work on some jet motion stuff. And then the second note is if I'm right on Bijan being a huge, heavy volume guy, I was not drafting Algier for a while. And then shout out to my Stealing Bananas co-host, Sean Siegel. He made the point to me that if I'm right on Bijan, then isn't Algier a really high upside handcuff at that point?
Yes.
That's a good point.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I kind of had that in my notes and then forgot to bring it up. In alignment with Siegel, it's you lose the standalone value, but you gain the league winning upside if Bijan gets hurt, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go to New Orleans, where they ran a ton of plays last year. You've got them slightly above average. We've got them even higher above average. You've got a 60% called pass rate. We're at 58.5%. The way that spits out is we're at about 35 pass attempts per game. You're at 35.5, but we're a little bit higher on the rush attempts in the high 20s. It's always tough with like the Taysom Hill stuff and whatnot at times for New Orleans to figure out exactly what to do with them. But at the end of the day, we've both got Carr over 4,000 yards, mid-20s touchdowns. This is another player that this whole NFC South, like I'm a lot of like backdoor stack ability here with a guy like Carr too. If you get into trouble, you're in a 3-quarterback build. There's definitely some things you can do with him. Anything on Carr and the team pass volume.
I think you put that very well. I mean, I agree. I think the new play call stuff is interesting. As far as the Kubiak's background, he comes from 1 year in San Fran. He was in Denver the year prior in Nathaniel Hackett's year, which is not promising. He was in Minnesota the year prior or a little bit prior to that in Mike Zimmer's final year. As far as like the tendencies of his offense, when I looked into it, he just seemed pretty balanced tendency wise. I had a hard time figuring out he doesn't have like a long, extensive history and hasn't been in any place for more than like 1 year where he's been in like a key role. So it's hard for me to understand what's going to happen here because their longtime offensive coordinator, who was Sean Payton's guy, was still there after Payton left and now is gone. Carmichael, he's in Denver now, working with Payton. And so they are shifting offensive coordinators and potentially offensive philosophies for the first time in a really long time. But I don't feel very confident at all about my, pace or pass rate projections for this team.
Yeah. And then going to running back, it's a difficult room to try and figure out. You've got Alvin Kamara, who, came back, caught a ton of passes at times for the Saints last year, like an absurd amount, but like obviously on the very wrong side of his career. You've got Jamal Williams, who's like egregiously inefficient, but coaches seem to trust him and like him. You've got Kendre Miller as the year 2 player. They couldn't really get it going year 1. It's a tough room to figure out. I know in most redraft leagues, Kamara is going to be a guy that's like pretty much X'd off your list if you're using the ETR rankings. There's some spots on Underdog where he just goes late enough that the ADP chasing guys joke about a comfy like 4% exposure. I might get a comfy like 2 to 4% Kamara exposure, like not a full fade, but like I need a running back and it's past ADP. Like Kamara's ADP is already at a pretty big discount there. I might take it saying
instead of an exposure blanket, a 4% exposure blanket, that's a 2% exposure sheet
the sheet. Yeah, we're at a sheet. We're not gonna we're gonna be cold, but we're not gonna freeze to death overnight. So you've got Kamara at 179 rush attempts. We have 170. You have 79 targets. We have 71. And it's those targets, equating to nearly 60 catches for both of us that really prop up the value proposition and kind of keep him from being like a full fade situation. And then, well, I'll throw to you on Kamara before we jump to Kendre versus Jamal.
Yeah, I'll just mention on Kamara, the missed tackles forced per touch, the yards after contact per attempt are sort of the 2 key running back efficiency metrics. If you go back to, a few years, 2019, 2020, his peak, his missed tackles forced per touch was up above 0.21. It went to 0.181 and 0.175 in 2021 and 2022. Then it was down to 0.137 last year. So we've really fallen off there. Yards after contact per attempt was up around 3 or 3+ in those peak years. Then it was down around 2.8, 2.72. It was all the way down to 2.51 last year. So we've seen this meaningful 4 to 5 year decline in his like efficiency metrics, his ability to make guys miss in space and gain more yardage after contact. I think people who watch him believe that too, but it's there. He's showing signs of age in the advanced metrics. Another note, he's typically always had some air yards, run some routes down the field. Last year had none. He's had a 1+ ADOT had a 1+ ADOT for 3 straight years, which is meaningful for a running back because a lot of their targets are behind the line of scrimmage. So to have an ADOT that's even 1.0, that means you're getting air yards. It's more like raw air yards. He was getting some. Last year, he had 9 total air yards. So it was, it's a 0.1 number. A lot of that was just dump offs late in the progression. But he ran an absurd 32% targets per out run last year. Like you said, like he got all the underneath stuff. He's a fragile play this year.
Very fresh.
But it also speaks to Derek Carr likes to throw to the backs a lot. And I think there's a lot of upside here. As you mentioned, the backup question's a big one. Kendre Miller is another guy I really, really like because I think that the receiving stuff, the dump off stuff that we were just talking about means there's upside behind him. And I have Kendre ahead of Jamal Williams. Kendre was banged up all last year. It was a 21-year-old rookie they took on day 2. A young back. He's going into his age 22 season. They add nothing, similar to what you said in the Bucs thing where they didn't add a whole lot. It tells you that they like something they have in their backfield. I don't think it's Jamal Williams, who had a 2.9 yards per carry last year. Kamara's aging. To me, what they've done this offseason is saying they think Kendre Miller is going to be a part of the equation and potentially a big part. It wouldn't surprise me if he's playing like a lot in week 1. If you ask me who's this year's Kyron Williams, where week 1 we were like, wow, he's actually in a split with Cam Akers and he takes over the backfield right away. The first guy I would say in the whole league is Kendre Miller would be the guy that wouldn't surprise me at all as a day 2 pick from a year ago, who's 22 and healthy now and was banged up last year. He played almost all or led their backfield in week 18 at the very end of last season and had a good run in that one game, in that one small sample. He had a good game. So anyway, I'm pretty high on him.
Yeah, that's someone like I want to be high on, but I just haven't gotten there at the current price. And I struggle with because I think the bet is so clear from like when you step back, it's so easy. It's so logical to, hey, let's fade Alvin Kamara and Jamal Williams, at their ages, at their efficiency. That is a very smart thing to do. With Kendre, I'm somewhat worried, with a head coach I don't necessarily trust, that a lot of those signals that should be like Kendre is going to be a part of this are like Jamal Williams is like they feel fine with Jamal Williams as RB2, even though they shouldn't feel fine with that. And I know Silva's hearing some rumblings. It's very early in the offseason, and beats in general always overrate the vets and underrate, the younger players. But he's just heard some negative stuff on Kendre being a bit, taking a step back and just not, being clearly behind Jamal Williams at this point. With that said, we have Kendre projected as the RB2 ahead of Jamal Williams for the, over the course of the season. But that sort of tempered my enthusiasm where.
That's a great point. It's not as clean as every time as you want it to be. On paper, this looks super clean. The 2 old backs were inefficient last year and Kendre Miller was hurt and everything I said sounds super clean. But if Kendre Miller's not up to the task, then he's not up to the task, right?
That is the risk. And it's tough, but it is tough because, there are a lot of backfields where you can see this like emergence without injury to things. And as you said, the value and the pass catching from Carr and there's some good stuff with team pace. And so it's a tough one for sure.
It feels like a situation to still take that swing into. Like, even if Jamal Williams is ahead of him, even going into week 1, if they're inefficient, both Kamara and Williams in the first month and in the second month, things tend to still tilt towards the younger back, and there's not a lot of competition here. And then the pass rate stuff to the running back is a key one. And as we move to the receivers, I got to give a shout out to Hayden Winks for being the first person to put this on my radar. He tweeted this a while back, but without Michael Thomas there anymore, who did still earn I think it was 64 targets last year, their top 3 receivers all have super high ADOTs. Chris Olave is 13.9 last year. Shaheed's obviously this deep threat. A.T. Perry was their other guy who had a really high ADOT. Somebody's going to have to get underneath looks. This is part of why Alvin Kamara had so many looks last year, because Michael Thomas only played about 10 games. In those other games, it seems like it was either throw way downfield to the receivers or just check down to Alvin Kamara. But somebody has to do something underneath. I think that is a decent size moat, we might say, for the running back targets. I think it's probably a little bit of a bull case for Juwan Johnson if you want to go there. But the way that I'm projecting it at receiver is I'm bringing Olave's ADOT down. And maybe this is not something that he actually has in his bag. I'm not entirely sure. But he's the really only meaningful target on a per route basis. And with, Michael Thomas gone, who's the guy? And then you have Shaheed as like a true deep threat, but not like an elite route runner. Whereas Olave, I think, is a more nuanced route runner. Who's the guy that the team would go like, yeah, this is a guy we need to bring down and run slants and run more intermediate routes in addition to some deep stuff? My read is that's got to be Olave. And so I think that's really bullish for Olave. We've seen some guys really take off the years where their profiles have gone from being either like pure deep threat or pure underneath to getting targets at all depths. Like Debo that one year was all underneath, and then 2021, boom, he started getting some air yards and he broke out. Stephon Diggs, his last year in Minnesota, was a pure deep threat. He goes to the Buffalo and they start throwing to him at all depths. His ADOT comes down, boom, targets are out of this world. He breaks out. For Olave, he's earned a ton of volume. He's had these 25+% targets per out run, even at the high ADOTs. But if he starts to get design touches and shorter stuff around the line of scrimmage, that could be really, really massive. And they have this gaping hole there. I don't know how else they fill it. I would think that Olave has to factor in there. So I'm pretty excited about him after I do my projection.
Yeah, I like Olave too. We both have him for around 140 targets, just under 1,200 receiving yards, around 6 touchdowns. Where he goes as wide receiver 11, we have him as wide receiver 11. We have wide receiver 11 above ADP because we're generally not taking those backs there. And I think that's about right. Probably not taking him above the London, Wilson, Marvin Harrison, AJ Brown grouping. Probably taking him behind those guys. But then after that, I'm pretty comfortable as Olave as my next receiver.
And the other note I would make is if it's not Olave, I mean, if you really want to get into like some crazy dart throws in deeper leagues, like this isn't a receiving core to get there, because I don't think Rashid Shaheed probably has that in his bag. He seems like a pretty pure deep threat. So whether it can A.T. Perry come down to that role, they brought in Cedric Wilson, who's a guy that I like made a little note. I mean, his ADOT actually looks the closest to Michael Thomas as far as the way that he's been used in his history. Wouldn't surprise me if he made some camp noise as like an underneath receiver. This Bub Means rookie. Don't really know a lot about his profile, to be completely frank with you, but it doesn't seem like it's the right fit necessarily. Or Jawan Johnson is the one that I mentioned. Somebody here could feasibly, in the short to intermediate range, be a pretty decent target hog. Johnson, for the record, put up his highest career targets per out run last year, has the foot thing, supposedly going to be ready for week 1, but he's looked like last year like he was making a step forward in his target earnings. So he's somebody that I'm interested in now that he's like free at the end of drafts at tight end.
Yeah, you're definitely making me feel better about Jawan right now, where I'm like, should I still be drafting? Because we liked him before the foot thing. And that's like, should we still be drafting him? And you just look at the competition. And I wasn't even considering the Michael Thomas absence and that part of the field, the void in that part of the field as much as you were. And I do feel good now, like continuing, like if I need a late tight end, I do think there's ceiling there. I believe he was the week 17 tight end leader at score last season. But I do think there's some upside there that's not there for a lot of these really late tight ends, especially this year. It's not a great group of really late tight ends. So I stay on the Jawan Johnson train. Taysom is tight end eligible on some sites. We both have him around 100 PPR points. I'll just make the note that he's always better on like half PPR because you're hoping that it's rushing stuff and finding the end zone more so than it is actually playing tight end and catching the football.
Yep. One little minor note on Bub Means. He had a 17.7 ADOT last year. So he's like I wanted to pull up his profile real quick and make that note that he's another like deep threat. They just have like a lot of deep threats. Even if he cracks the rotation, he seems like that's how he was in college. He seems like another deep threat.
Silva just dropped a link to an article in our Slack chat as we're recording. So it says Drake London : we're trying to play really, really fast on offense this year. So
oh my God.
Oh man.
Atlanta, there's some fun stuff here in the NFC South. It's our first division. There's some players that, I mentioned Bucky Irving's my highest player. Atlanta's the team that I want to be in on more than any other team. And especially you telling me that, man, it's going to get dangerous. My exposures are going to get way too high.
I'll fully admit sometimes I get overly excited when I feel like I'm seeing something the market's not seeing that really makes me want to buy into it. And that's sort of like me with Atlanta, where I'm like, they're moving, but the market's not moving enough. Like it's really could just be something totally else. But let's go to Carolina. They bring Canales over as head coach. We know Frank Reich got fired midseason last year. train wreck year for Carolina, rookie year for Bryce Young. We've got them around league average plays per game. You're a little bit lower. I think we might come down too, honestly, just because they're not going to be that good. And it sounds like Canales wants to run the football a decent bit, which isn't great for plays per game. So we might come down to slightly below league average. We're both
They
around
were weirdly fast paced last year. They were like super high in plays per game.
A lot of like garbage time stuff.
Right.
I know we had some weird stuff just betting props throughout the season where we're like, we got to take these Bryce Young unders. And for a while, he was hitting these overs in garbage time. And eventually it kind of regressed and they got to the plays they were. But yeah, we may pull back on Carolina plays, but we're still both around 550 pass attempts for Bryce Young, around 20 pass touchdowns. You're a little bit more optimistic. So just curious your thoughts on Carolina. You know, like what are the odds that things materially change for the good for Bryce Young this year? And you know, what might that look like?
I think it would look like Deontay Johnson really being the player that he's been in terms of earning volume throughout his career. I have some notes on him that we'll get to, but I do think the receivers were a big part of the issue last year, although not the only issue. I think Young was a big part of the issue as well. But I do think that they hired Dave Canales specifically to help Young. He was good with Geno Smith 2 years ago. He was good with Baker Mayfield. It's that quarterback whisperer type of hire. And I do think they're going to be conservative and run the ball and try to put Young in good spots and try to do play action and a lot of that stuff. It's kind of like a vibes-based take. But yeah, I mean, I'm projecting them to be below average in play volume. They have a low win total. I don't think they're going to be great. I think they're going to try to be statistically okay. It's like sort of like what their goal is for the season. And so that's why, I mean, that's kind of why my projections come out statistically okay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Let's go to running back. We might be hot on Brooks, and this is Jonathan Brooks, the rookie. This is one that I'm having a tough time figuring out, where kind of do like betting on, you know, the first running back drafted, probably goes a bit earlier, if not for the ACL injury. He goes to a backfield that competition's pretty minimal. Miles Sanders fell off in a huge way last year. They've got him and Chuba Hubbard. So I part of me wants to bet on that. And then part of me is like, well, it's not going to be in good offense, most likely. And we don't know how much of a workload he's going to get year one. When's he going to be ready with the injury? Right now, we're at 204 carries. You're at 167. And most of that swings to Hubbard, where you're at 150. We're at 108. And we might just be a little overly optimistic on when Brooks sees the field and how much that quickly.
I don't know if that's you being optimistic or me being pessimistic, but that's where my projections are. I wrote in my notes, I basically have it as Chuba as like the 60% guy in the first half, with Miles kind of starting as the 40% guy and fading, and then Brooks working in. And then, because Miles has all this guaranteed money, he's probably not going to get cut. He's going to be there. They'll probably use him early because he's the veteran. Brooks, because he's coming back from the ACL, maybe not playing a lot early, but eventually, again, because I think they want to sell positivity a step forward, I do think we'll see down the stretch Jonathan Brooks play a lot. I actually think they're going to be like, this is the guy for the final 6 to 8 games. But you're maybe not going to see him for the first 4, maybe start to see him in the next 4. And then he's 65 plus, you know, down the stretch, and Chuba's the backup. And so Chuba's overall role ends up looking good. I don't draft Chuba a lot because I do feel like, you know, you want back-weighted production and it's not going to be there. I feel like it's going to be very front-weighted.
I do like these builds, these hyper fragile running back builds where you're only taking like 4 or 5 with Jonathan Brooks as like your 3rd or 4th in there, where you're like, okay, you know, I'm investing in the running back position so I can get through the first third of the season without Jonathan Brooks based on what I've invested in running back. And then I've got a little bit more juice in that 3rd, 4th guy late, like understanding that, you know, it's harder sometimes those hyper fragile builds to take the guys that don't have a big ceiling. Cause it's like, if you hit on the first 3 guys, like what are the odds that you even crack your lineup? And then the lineup sort of depending on those guys hitting, but with a guy like Brooks, where you can see the late season ceiling a bit more, I think he fits well into those builds. Okay, wide receiver. We've got Deontay Johnson to start. We've got 124 targets. You've got 137 targets for Deontay Johnson. He was someone we were really ahead of ADP on to start. The ADP has caught up a little bit. We're still a little bit ahead positionally on him. We have him wide receiver 42 on Underdog. The ADP is wide receiver 44. And we're pretty much in line on FFPC where it favors him scoring wise a bit more full PPR. He's wide receiver 37 there, but he's just earned targets basically like wherever he's gone. And he steps into a situation, Ben, where, you know, you've got Adam Thielen, who's really aging. You've got Xavier Leggett, who's a shaky rookie prospect. And then you've got two like really failed, you know, prospects in Jonathan Mingo and Terrace Marshall. There's just, the door is definitely open to a very big target share here.
Right. And if you look at him, Deontay in particular, on a per game basis or like a target share basis, his targets per game last year fell. I guess I don't have targets per game on the Pro Football Reference list that I'm looking at, but his receptions per game fell. He had some games where he didn't play the full snap share. That's the situation here. Like I always end up talking about a couple of these guys where the playing time was a little inconsistent. He was hurt in week 1, only 43% of the snaps, only 66% in his return in week 7. He missed a bunch of time. And then after that, he was above, you know, that 66% for 6 straight games. His playing time faded in the final 3 regular season games, which is kind of weird because they were actually in it. So it's kind of confusing why they were fading him. He ends up playing 85% in their playoff game because they win out and they make the playoffs. But in week 18, he only played 48% again. He was fading down. I'm not sure why he wasn't playing more in the must-win games. But the point is, he was below 50% in some of these games. He was in the 65% range, which is stuff that he typically never did. And Carolina went out and got him to presumably play him as the number 1 wide receiver. So I don't anticipate that he would have weird playing time like that. I say all this because if you look at his per route run stuff, he actually had the highest yards per out run of his career last year, had a little higher ADOT. He had a higher targets per out run last year than 2022, even though his like targets per game fell down. So if you're looking at him from a targets per game perspective, that's why I was trying to find that stat. It can look a little bit more alarming, I think, than when I look at it from the per route run stuff. When I have it, so I just pull up the targets per game. He was at 6.7 last year, targets per game, but some of that's because some of those games he only played half the game. 8.6 the year prior by my numbers. His target market share was at 27% in 2022 and only 18% last year. That might be the full season, target share, not just the games he was in. But I note that because it looks like a big drop off in certain metrics. And then you go look at the targets per route run, and he was actually earning more targets per route than the year prior, very marginally. It's not as high as his peak in 2021, but I don't think he's lost a step. You talked about the open score earlier. I know Matt Harmon's reception perception loves Deontay Johnson. Everyone who charts him or looks at him in these types of ways says he creates separation and gets open at will. That's what the Panthers did not have last year. A lot of the Adam Thielen stuff was very like underneath, kind of dump off, him sitting in zones. It felt like, I remember writing about it in Stealing Signals as like, Adam Thielen is getting a ton of volume, but it's the kind of stuff that defenses aren't even trying to take away this stuff. Like if they had a functional offense, wouldn't want this to be the priority in the offense. I told you before the show, I do think Adam Thielen still matters and is still going to play and get targets, but Deontay's the guy that comes in and is capable of earning volume right away. On Thielen last year, he ran the 4th most routes in the NFL. His targets per out run had been falling off going into that last year. It shot back up a little bit, but only a decent number, 21.4%. At an 8.0 ADOT, a below average ADOT is not particularly strong. And he already didn't look great under the hood other than that. Some of the efficiency stuff had fallen off, etc. Deontay, for the record, has been at least 1.5 percentage points higher in targets per out run every season for 4 straight years, dating back to his rookie year. And then Thielen had been lower than his own number last year for 4 years prior. So that was a 5-year high for him, in addition to running the 4th most routes in the NFL. But my take now is Deontay's the guy that benefits from the idea of running the 4th most routes. He's the guy that's going to be out there every snap and run a ton of routes. So I'm pretty in on Deontay. If he can actually be out there a bunch and still be a targets per out run guy, be a quick winner. I think a lot of the stuff that we saw last year, one of the big trends we saw last year is wide receiver 1 target shares league-wide spiked. They went up a bunch. The highest, in fact, rate since 2015 the concentration of fantasy points to the number one player on each offense was the highest since 2015 from some research I did earlier this offseason. But some speculation I've seen around that is it's because of the way the defenses are playing a little bit, and it's the guys that can win quick and early in routes. And I think that's what Deontay offers you, and that can really mean big targets. I feel like the 137 targets I projected for him is potentially light by a potentially decent margin, that he's a guy that, because there's not much target competition here, Leggett could be a hit as a rookie, but he's a vertical threat. He's probably not going to be a high volume guy. Bryce Young's ADOT was kind of low last year, didn't actually push vertically a ton. I think Canales will try to get him to push vertically more, but I mean, it just seems like Deontay's stepping into a situation where he could really, really rack up volume.
Yeah, we're pretty conservative on our inputs. I feel like they're 23% target share. We actually have some ceiling docs in our ceiling cases in terms of like odds of hitting ceiling and some of the efficiency stuff that's more offense related than it is Deontay related. And like I said, with all that, we're still a little bit ahead ADP, and definitely possible to push that target share a bit further. With Adam Thielen, you know, everyone jokes with me about liking old players because we are a little bit ahead of ADP on Adam Thielen and a little bit behind on Leggett. And it's tough. Like, it's definitely not a player that I'm out there going like, oh, I want to be in on Adam Thielen, you know, by any means. He's one of those guys that we talk about in redraft leagues that you're crossing off. Like, you know, you just don't need that in your room. Even in best ball, the scenarios where I'm drafting him are these wide receiver teams where I went a little bit lighter early that need more quantity at wide receiver. And I want some guys that are going to give me a higher floor of points, especially the first half of the season. And I think Thielen probably does that for you, just given, again, the lack of competition. Even if Deontay really takes over, there's still probably room for Thielen to see a good chunk of targets. We're both at about 84 targets for Thielen. It's not a high ceiling case, but there's some usable weak case that you can make for Thielen there. So
for reference, he had like 135 last year. That's 50 less than he had last year in this not in the same offense, but in on the same team with this quarterback who was comfortable throwing him the ball. He's a veteran. He's respected in the locker room. They're going to play him in the slot. Deontay's going to be the X. You're going to have Leggett as the vertical option. I mean, at least that's the way that it looks to me on paper. And yeah, like, why wouldn't he just do what he did last year for parts of it? He could lose that role over time, I think, is the risk.
And that's where, if you've drafted a 0 RB team with 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds, Adam Thielen doesn't really serve a purpose, even if we have him ranked ahead of ADP. You know, he doesn't really serve a purpose. But if you've taken 2 or 3 receivers early, and then you want to take advantage of like, oh, I can still build a team with elite onesies and be good at running back and then come back to receiver, you might want to mix Thielen in, you know, with some late round rookies that have a little bit lower odds of hitting the lineup in terms of frequency, but they have a bit more season ending upside. And
there's going to be some people that are stoked because they took too much Adam Thielen when he has like 9 targets in week 3. And then they're going to find out that that's not going to sustain very well.
And then with Leggett, I have a really tough time with Leggett because there's part of me that's like, this guy, at the end of the day, even though it was the last pick, he was a round 1 wide receiver, and we've got him kind of buried relative to the other round 1 wide receivers. And he doesn't have a ton of competition. Again, like, if you think Adam Thielen's dust, you've obviously got Deontay as big competition, but outside of that, like, Terrace Marshall and Jonathan Mingo ain't it. You've got a rookie tight end too that could be pretty, like, there's not much. So we're a little bit behind ADP. I know Tej Seth on Twitter, who does a lot of good analytics stuff, was pointing out like his yards per route run against man in college was like really, really strong. But this guy was also like a complete 1-year wonder type. And so there's profile concerns there. So it's like, I don't know, there's a lot of jumbling facts, and I don't know if I should just be like, round 1 wide receiver that's pretty cheap, so take him, or like, no, this guy's probably gonna be brought along slowly and might, you know, has a higher bust possibility than these other round 1 wide receivers.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. He was a fifth-year breakout last year, but in his first 4 years, he didn't run 200 routes in any of the seasons. And there's some talk that he was like more just like an athlete coming out of high school, had to learn the receiver position a little bit. He's so big and athletic that what I do like to see, even though it was a late breakout and we like to see the early production, is that he at least translated that into stats, right? Because one of the things that we talk about with the athletic guys is often they get overdrafted purely on their athleticism. And it's like, if they can't translate that athleticism to stats at the college level, I don't really trust that they're going to be able to beat NFL defenses. There's guys that are just athletic, but they don't have skills. Leggett, at least at an older age, was able to show us that he could translate that to a year where he had a 24 plus targets per out run at a 13 plus ADOT, 12.9 yards per target, 3+ yards per out run last year. It was all really, really strong in the breakout season. So, I'm not like all in on his profile. He might be a bust for the reasons you just said, but I do think there's a wide band on what he is. And we know that the rest of the pass game is probably nothing. And to your point about Thielen, even if you like, that's what I noticed in my projections. I was telling you before the show, like, God, I'm begrudgingly higher on Thielen than I want to be, because if you try to take Thielen down, you have to either give Deontay Johnson a massive target share, or you have to be higher on like Jonathan Mingo than you should be, or like, because like he looked really bad last year, right? I mean, he's probably already a bust after 1 year, unfortunately. And Terrace Marshall has looked really poor so far. I'm kind of high on Jatavian Sanders as a potential wide band player as well that could maybe hit this year out of the tight end spot.
And I did want to ask you about that. That is, one of our bigger discrepancies we've had on this pod so far is we're really cautious. We have that tight end role split and not a ton of targets to it. So we've got like 32 targets to Sanders, 32 targets to Tremble. You've definitely thrown some more wide, and we're much higher on Mingo than you are. So you've taken some of those wide receiver targets, given it to Sanders. You're at 62 on Sanders, similar on Tremble. So it's a little bit coming from Tremble, but mostly just coming from these wide receivers that we don't project to be, that good of target earners. So just wanted to gauge your confidence level on Sanders. I imagine 62 targets, that's a pretty strong late round pick.
Yeah.
But
my confidence level is not super high. I don't have his efficiency particularly high on those. I got him for like 430 receiving yards and 2.8 touchdowns, right? Like it's not like incredibly high on him, but it gets back to what I was just saying about the wide band stuff. I feel fairly confident that Mingo isn't going to break out this year. Fairly confident that Terrace Marshall is not going to break out. Fairly confident that Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas are what they are. And so because there's such an opening here, where I tend to land is that, there's got to be more volume going somewhere. As we talked about Thielen kind of fading late in the year, I think where that kind of goes is to the young tight end probably. Legette's more of a vertical player. And so he has some structural issues as well, where like if he starts to hit, do teams start to do the takeaway explosives and cover two shells and roll stuff over the top on him? I think some of the high ADOT guys that are deep threats that's not the way the NFL is trending, is for their types of targets. So it can be a little tricky for him as well to hit in that way. But Sanders is a guy that I think some of that underneath volume that went to Thielen a lot last year is available for him. My confidence level is not high. It's just that I'm not confident in anyone else in this. They didn't fix everything for Bryce Young, but at least Deontay Johnson is a step in the right direction. It's just that there's still a lot of not very good target earners here behind Deontay.
Yeah, this is a team overall that, you struggle to see the upside beyond Deontay and Brooks. And I do think those players are pretty good values where they are, particularly Deontay. Brooks, I'm a little less sure on. I know Pat Crane is hoping that there will be some offseason news on Brooks where people get hit with the reality that he's probably not going to be, as ready early in the season, and you could potentially get a better price tag. And then I think that'd be great. I still think he's draftable where he is, but that would obviously be, better if you could just get a better price tag. I'd feel a bit more confident.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I do think down the stretch, we're going to see some pretty big workloads for him. So I like him, even though you have to pay for him, as like, you mentioned him as part of a hyper fragile build. I like him at the front end of like some 0 RB builds too, as like a back weighted upside play. Cause you can get some cheap volume this year. And then you come back with like a Javonte Williams or Devin Singletary or something, and you're like, yeah, that guy's my early season RB1, and Jonathan Brooks is my late season upside.
Basically, any time you can get back weighted upside into your RB room, there's good ways and logical ways to make it work for sure. Because then it's you're taking quantity at running back to cover those early weeks, even though you didn't invest a ton, and then he's your kind of hammer, hopefully late, to give you the weekly spike upside that you might not have. All right, that's gonna do it for us on the first episode of the projection special. Again, check out Ben's stuff at bengretch.substack.com. You can find my stuff over at Establish the Run. And if everyone can, give us a subscribe and thumbs up on the YouTube page for Establish the Edge, that'd be great. Also, if you're listening on the podcast feed, that helps us out a lot. But Ben and I will be back. Part 2 of the projection special is going to be the AFC South, and I definitely have some Jaguars takes and some questions I want to talk to Ben in that division about. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.